Freedom of speech is a fundamental right here in America, but you can't speak freely unless you think freely too. That's why I use Ground News. It's not just a news aggregator, it's a tool for fostering independent thought and media literacy. One feature I find invaluable is their factuality score. It evaluates the reporting practices of news sources using ratings from third-party monitoring organizations. These scores factor in the credibility of sources used, the speed at which corrections are made, and whether the language used retains important context. So if you value the ability to form your own opinions based on a wide range of information, go check out ground.news. And if you decide to subscribe, you can get 15% off by using my link in the show notes. Your subscription supports this podcast and promotes the kind of media transparency that's essential for a robust marketplace of ideas. And now, on to the episode. I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And free speech is not only foundational to American democracy, but to our ability to understand our fellow citizens and ourselves. Yet almost from the moment it was enshrined in the First Amendment, this right has faced repeated legal and cultural challenges. Today, from college campuses to social media platforms, new battles are raging over what speech should be permitted in the public square. Our guest this week believes that we may be facing the most dangerous anti-free speech period in our history, and explains why protecting even the most controversial speech is vital to preserving America itself. Jonathan Turley is a law professor, columnist, television analyst, and litigator. Since 1998, he has held the Shapiro Chair for Public Interest Law at George Washington University Law School. He has served as counsel in some of the most notable cases of the last 2 decades, representing members of Congress, judges, whistleblowers, 5 former attorney generals, accused spies and terrorists, journalists, protesters, and workers at Area 51. He has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, and has worked as a legal analyst for CBS, NBC, BBC, and Fox. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be with you.
Well, I'm glad that we're both glad that you're here. The Indispensable Right is a book about the history and importance of free speech and the, quote, wonderfully unreasonable people that brought it into being and defended it as a protected right here in the U.S. And it took you 30 years to write. You said, quote, I wanted to not just write another free speech book. I wanted to explore why we are still struggling with free speech, end quote. So to start us off, how is The Indispensable Right different from free speech books that came before it?
Well, there's been many fine free speech books, which I refer to in The Indispensable Right. It's just that I didn't want to just complain about the attacks on free speech or the continuing struggle over what it means. I wanted to try to understand how we got to this place, to look at the personalities and periods that help shape our view of free speech, to better understand why we're still struggling with it. And I also wanted to give a complete account of our history, an unvarnished history. And what comes out of that history is indeed wonderfully unreasonable people. You know, George Bernard Shaw said that unreasonable people expect the world to conform to them. And he then added, that's why history is always made by unreasonable people. Well, this is a book in part about these unreasonable people, people who literally would not shut up. The book starts at when free speech was first identified and protected in ancient Greece, but it quickly goes to the founding of our republic. And I think that at the very beginning of this republic, we had a moment of clarity as to what free speech really is. What the book suggests is that the most revolutionary aspect of the American Revolution came with the First Amendment, when it stated that free speech would be protected against the government in virtually absolute terms. But many of the framers believed, philosophers at that time, that free speech was a natural right, that it wasn't something created by the government or maintained because it was good for the government. It was something that adhered to you as a human being, that moment of clarity was lost after a few years. And we've been on a slippery slope since then.
You said in an interview with former ACLU president Nadine Strassman, quote, "I wanted to look at what free speech really is, why we struggle with it, and how we can get through this period, which may be the most dangerous anti-free speech period in our history," end quote. And as you just said, you cover America's struggles with free speech since our founding. And and we can get into this. There have been very tumultuous and dire periods in America's history in regards to free speech. So why is this moment potentially the most dangerous as it pertains to our First Amendment right?
Well, that's one of the reasons why this book is subtitled Free Speech in an Age of Rage, not the Age of Rage. This is not our first age of rage. I mean, this country was born in rage. That was what the Boston Tea Party was. And in fact, the book looks at what I call rage rhetoric and how the government has often struggled with what to do with rage rhetoric, and how rage rhetoric by citizens often would become state rage as the government cracked down on political dissidents. And this goes back to those unreasonable people. Many of them were socialists, communists, anarchists, feminists, unionists. They were all very different, but they had one thing in common. They believed they had a right to speak even when nobody wanted them to do so. And you look at some of these people and you can't help but be inspired. You know, some of the people even before the revolution, there was a man by the name of John Lilburne. He was called Freeborn John. He was a leveler in England. He was tried in the Star Chamber. Many people don't realize, and this book goes into great detail, that the Star Chamber was created to prosecute speech. The English courts had declined to prosecute people for treason just because they said things against the government. So the government created the Star Chamber, which allowed for prosecutions of sedition. And John Lilburne was one of the first people convicted. And he was taken on the back of an ox cart and flogged from Fleet Street to Palace Yard. He was then pilloried in front of the prison, and he still wouldn't yield. He still continued to speak out, and they gagged him. And even then, he started to stamp his feet in defiance. They finally gave up and just threw him into a dungeon. But it's people like Freeborn John that really shows why this is a natural right, why it's so difficult for the government to extinguish free speech, because it's part of our DNA.
Let's dig into that a little bit then, Jonathan. Hearing about, obviously, the story of what Freeborn John went through, I'll circle back to the question I asked, which is comparing Freeborn John's punishment to, let's say, getting canceled on Twitter or being fired from your job due to a social media mob. How are those two things comparable? Why is this era particularly bad if you look at what happened in the past?
Well, certainly flogging is probably a bit more grotesque. It certainly concentrates the mind, even though it didn't break Freeborn John or any of these other characters in the book. But the reason today's threat is, in my view, the most serious, the most dangerous, potentially the most lasting, is that we've never seen an alliance like this. We've never seen an alliance in an anti-free speech movement of government, corporate, academic, and media interests. Usually academia and the media have been the champions of free speech. And yet now the media has been unrelenting. They've been running article after article about how dangerous free speech is, how we need to censor people. The New York Times just ran a piece entitled, "The First Amendment is Out of Control." In academia, there's a movement to amend the First Amendment. One of my colleagues is leading that movement. It's very popular. It's been given praise in the media. And her position is that the First Amendment is, quote, excessively individualistic, and that free speech needs to be balanced against concepts like equity. Other academics have said that free speech is now a threat to our very existence. Now, part of this is an attempt, which is never an easy one, to get a free people to give up part of their freedom. I mean, to do that, they have to be afraid. They have to be very afraid. And so in many of these columns and papers and books, there's this drumbeat that free speech is threatening your jobs, your privacy, your safety, your very lives. And we can't assume that we will come out of this period unscathed. Now, part of the other thing that makes this dangerous is that for years I've written about the anti-free speech movement in Europe. Now, our movement has come largely from higher education. It's been metastasized in the media and politics. But there is an established anti-free speech movement in Europe, and free speech is in a free fall in Great Britain, France, Germany, even our close neighbor of Canada. The criminalization of speech is ever widening in those areas. And in England, a judge not long ago sent someone to jail for toxic ideologies, literally a thought crime. We have to look at what's happening in Europe because that wave has reached our shores. And some of us in the free speech community have been warning about this for years. If you want to see what we're looking at, and there are many people in the United States who are allies of that movement in Europe, take a look at what's happening in France and Great Britain and Germany.
You break down how we conceive of free speech into basically two different camps. You said that, quote, free speech is a human condition, end quote, which is just a beautiful phrase that I love. And you've said also, quote, this is not a right that we should protect because it makes democracy better, that it has this function in democracy, but that it makes us better. It's something that humans need to have, end quote. And it was a view of speech, as you've said, that was captured in the First Amendment, but then that clarity was almost immediately lost at the turn of the 19th century. So what happened so that so soon after the enshrinement of the First Amendment, we began to restrict speech?
The book spends a fair amount on that because it is, in some ways, our original sin as a republic. That clarity was lost literally within 5 years or so as Federalist judges started to uphold the arrest of citizens in the Adams administration. So it was a little more than 5 years, but very quickly within a decade. And those judges fell back in default on the sort of Blackstonian or English view, what I call the functionalist view or instrumentalist view. What that is a view that we defend free speech because it's good for democracy. Well, it certainly is good for democracy. I think we would all agree on that. But it's much more than that. The problem is that if free speech is based on its function as being good for democracy, it allows for trade-offs, right? Because there's some speech that you can then say it's not good for democracy. You can call it disinformation or false news. By the way, some of those terms were used during the early censorship period under Great Britain and in the early American Republic. They used terms like false news to justify censorship. Every anti-free speech movement in our history has pretended that they're facing some unprecedented threat. In reality, they often use the very same language, not just the same rationales. But what happened then is that we got onto the slippery slope of functionalism, and it allowed for these trade-offs. And that became a morass, particularly with jurists like Oliver Wendell Holmes. I have a whole chapter on Holmes. Because what I say is that if you really want to see how the United States lost its way on free speech, look at how Holmes lost his way, because he's intriguing. And I spent a lot of time going through his papers, through his history, even his youth, because there was something about Holmes's opinions which are horrific. I mean, he was responsible for some of the most outrageous anti-free speech opinions in history. But there was something about his opinions that really stood out to me. It was a vehemence. It was almost an anger when natural rights were raised, this concept that there was a pre-existing right for free speech. What comes out of Holmes is really nothing short of anger at that suggestion. And so it was interesting to sort of drill down as to where that came from and why Holmes ultimately regretted some of his opinions.
The book is replete with examples of how history just keeps repeating itself again and again in our country's troubled relationship with expression. It's a bit of a curiosity to me, Jonathan. I mean, I suppose I say that with some luxury of living in our modern age, but free speech is our most foundational and cherished right here in America. We celebrate it in our movies. You know, you have characters giving impassioned speeches about the importance of free expression. Every child learns about its importance in school. Every adult, hopefully, knows of at least a few instances in our history in which the right was challenged or curtailed and the resulting negative outcomes. And yet there are still calls, as you've noted, every day from some corner of the left or right from those in the public or in power to have free speech limited. And as you said, 5 years after the right was enshrined in the Constitution, it was already beginning to be curtailed. So we seem to, as a people, have these recurring bouts of amnesia around our love for and the function of free speech. We seem to love it and hate it at the same time. Why are we trapped in this endless cycle of loving free speech, but then wanting to shut it down?
Michael, that put it beautifully. And I think it is indeed this cycle. The strange thing about free speech is that it's so much better at a distance. People look back at the earlier periods that I go through in the book, and they're horrified. They go, oh my gosh, look at the Red Scare. Look at the Alien and Sedition Acts. How could people do that? And yet, when they're in the moment, when they're afraid or they're angry, they lose that perspective. And that, unfortunately, is part of this unvarnished history. We're much better at dealing with free speech at a distance. In the moment, we often see the necessity of these trade-offs. Something is disinformation or misinformation or malinformation. There's some reason why we have to silence others. It's very difficult, understandably, for people to hear someone who they disagree, even someone who's grotesque, and to say, I believe he has a right to be heard. And it's not that we agree with them, right? We don't in many cases. But the people that we hate the most are often right, at least on free speech. Charlotte Anita Whitney is featured in the book early on because the Whitney case is where Louis Brandeis called this the indispensable right. And the reason I wanted to use that title is because it captures this conflict that we have. Here was Brandeis, one of the great civil libertarians in history, who used this term, and yet he used it in a case where he upheld the conviction of Whitney, who was a communist who was engaged in political speech.
Yeah.
And it just perfectly captures this disconnect between our values and our actions.
Hearing you say that, I can't help but think of that famous piece of writing by Martin Niemöller. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. It seems like some of our struggle with understanding the value of the full scope of free speech comes from a lack of empathy or being able to see outside of ourselves. Something that we talk about a lot in this podcast is how lack of empathy is often rooted in the idea that we are all the heroes of our own stories. We and our kin and our compatriots were the good ones. We are on the right side of history. It's those other people who are bad. And it seems to be that this inability to project ourselves outward into the bodies of other people and see, okay, wait, this thing that I'm arguing for in terms of restricting free speech isn't just going to affect this other person I view as bad. It could also soon affect me. And it seems like this inability to see outside of ourselves is what causes this cycle.
Oh, I think that is very true. In some ways, free speech is the most difficult of rights to protect because of the very problem that you present. It allows us to have that subjectivity in the moment when we're most afraid, we're most angry. Due process is another right that's hard to protect, but often there is a person's life that concentrates the mind. There's a trial that frames our thoughts. Free speech is more of an abstraction. And that means it's more vulnerable. When I speak at universities, I often ask the students how much they would sell me their right of free speech. And I used to say, by the way, would you sell it to me for $1 million? I decided actually to stop that because $1 million is itself sort of an abstraction. I got a much better response when I said, would you sell it to me for $200,000? And then the hands go up because $200,000, they can imagine that's college, that's a car maybe, that's a down payment. It's much more accessible conceptually. And the hands go up because I can see them thinking, when was the last time I used free speech? Why is it that important to me? I can understand why it is an abstraction. It has always been the irony in history is that a free people often has very little experience with a lack of freedom. And that can make the rights themselves seem largely tangential to your life, not that significant.
Right. We take it for granted because it's so plentiful, like in the same way we might take breathing for granted until we're choking to death.
Right. That's exactly right.
Much of the friction around how we define what is or is not permissible speech is due to two competing views around the purpose and function of free expression. And this struggle to figure out what free speech is for goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, who had two separate terms for freedom of speech. So what were they? Why were they distinct? And how does that over 2,000-year-old distinction affect how we talk about free speech today?
Well, the book goes into this, and I won't massacre the Greek language, but one of the terms deals with free speech in the marketplace or the agora or public. And the other one is free speech in private. And it's not surprising that the term for free speech in public, in the marketplace, was the first we see being protected, because that's the most likely speech that is going to be punished, right? That's the speech that you're going to have the greatest confrontation on. Yet the Greeks recognized free speech in both places, in your private dealings, in your home, as well as in the agora. What functionalism does is it gives more protection for the public speech, because that has a function in favor of democracy. And what this book looks at is why that's just fundamentally wrong. That we have to protect speech, not because it benefits democracy or it is right in the sense of advancing worthy ideas. We have to protect speech because it's something that all human beings need to be fully human. Early on in the book, I explore what that means, because we are actually physiologically wired for free speech. And I go through studies of prisoners in segregation, explorers who are cut off from people. What these studies show is that parts of the brain actually do shrink. They manifest this failure to have expression. So areas like the hippocampus and other parts of the brain can actually shrink. And we've also seen with people who have lost part of their frontal lobe. I talk about Phineas Gage, who is a famous medical case because he was a railroad supervisor who had what's called a tamping iron used to ignite explosives get blown through his head. And it took out his frontal lobe, essentially. And the physician in attendance realized that they had a curiosity on their hand because he expected Phineas Gage to die, but he didn't. He was actually conversant. He recovered. And he decided that he might be able to figure out what that part of the brain does because part of it's not there anymore. And he started to chronicle how over time, Gage's friends said that he became more animal-like, more prone to violence, to confrontation. He had trouble with his relationships. He became less expressive. And all of these different studies and cases really sort of highlight the fact that we are hardwired for speech. That means that we have this need to project part of ourselves into the world around us. Now, part of that can be horrific, right? We have racists, anti-Semites, other people that have terrible visions to project into society. And it's hard to protect them because you find their ideas so offensive. But it's not their ideas, but the human right that we're protecting. And then we rely on free speech of the rest of us to counter that bad speech. We use good speech. And time again, that's been proven to be effective. What has not been proven to be effective, not once, are laws of censorship, blacklisting, where you try to silence views because they are dangerous. That has been an utter failure since the beginning of recorded time.
You break out the concept of free speech into a functionalist view versus an autonomous view, which you've spoken to. The functionalist view meaning that it's necessary for the pursuit and upholding of democracy. You need free speech in order for democracy to function. But tying it directly to the function of democracy means that it's more liable to be restricted when it's existing outside of that function. And I went back and I looked at some of the ACLU's older statements on free speech in preparation for this conversation. I read their 1997 position paper on freedom of expression, and it seemed clear to me that at that time, the organization was robustly in the autonomous free speech camp. From the paper, freedom of expression is, quote, the foundation of self-fulfillment, The right to express one's thoughts and to communicate freely with others affirms the dignity and worth of each and every member of society and allows each individual to realize his or her full human potential. Thus, freedom of expression is an end in itself, and as such deserves society's greatest protection, end quote. I recently spoke with Greg Lukianoff. He's the president and CEO of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And I want to get your thoughts on this, Jonathan. It feels like that organization has more taken up the mantle of the autonomous view, while recently the ACLU has taken, in my view, a more narrow, decidedly functionalist approach. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do, and I actually talk about it a bit in the book. It's tragically ironic because I worked very closely with the ACLU with what is now called the old guard. The ACLU has changed a great deal. The old guard, and I include myself in there, tended to embrace free speech as the defining purpose of the ACLU, and also this autonomous model of free speech was the one that the ACLU litigated and defended. That's changed. What's a bit ironic is that the ACLU originally was not one of the most protective organizations of free speech. They actually were, at their founding, much more abridged than the Free Speech Society that I talk about, the Association of Free Speech Advocates, who embraced the autonomous view. The ACLU adopted a much more moderate position in their view at the time. But then by the 1970s, the ACLU had become the leading voice of free speech in the truest sense. And then in the last couple of decades, the free speech foundations of the modern ACLU were lost. I talked to one ACLU leader who admitted to me that they now don't view their case involving the Nazi march in Skokie as something that they want to advertise, because I had raised it and said, you really hit the high mark when you fought for the rights of Nazis. You had Jewish lawyers litigating on behalf of Nazis because they felt they needed to support free speech. And the response was, we're not as proud as we were of that case. And I noted that it's no longer highlighted by the ACLU. And I think that says something as a cautionary tale. Even the most faithful can have a crisis of faith. Even the ACLU can lose that North Star of free speech. I think the result for the ACLU has been confusion. I think that they have a serious problem of identity. Since they have moved away from that view, there's been this uncertainty as to when the ACLU will fight for free speech. And there's a feeling that they won't be in that fight for some views that they consider to be just too offensive.
Seems like today's ACLU, their stance on free speech is more of a retreat to the mean, similar to how only, about a decade after the First Amendment was ratified, the courts retreated to a functionalist view and away from an autonomous one.
I think that's true. And I think when you look at the ACLU, you also see some of the other characters in this book. This book is not just about the heroes, but the villains of free speech. And many of these villains were people that we have long held in highest regard. People like John Adams was a terrible hypocrite when it came to free speech. He was, without question, the most anti-free speech president in history, as his administration actually tried to arrest and execute people that they disagreed with. But even people like Abraham Lincoln betrayed free speech. And Abraham Lincoln is a person that had great sensitivity, great empathy for constitutional rights. But he allowed for this crackdown to occur. There was a case involving Clement Vallandigham, who was a member of Congress, who was arrested by General Ambrose Everett Burnside. And, Burnside was a true blunt tool. He was a rather poor military leader, and he became a horrific military governor under Lincoln. And his response to criticism of the war by Copperheads and others was to have them all arrested. And that included this former member of Congress. And it's not that Vallandigham was pro-slavery. He was anti-war. Indeed, when he was found guilty, Lincoln couldn't bear the thought of just putting him in jail. So he had him banished. And they walked him across the front line and told him just to keep walking until he met a Confederate soldier. And this former congressman said, I am your prisoner. I am a citizen of Ohio. I am not here by my own choice. and he was held over by the Confederacy. But it shows how even someone like Lincoln could abandon these core values.
Looking at the writings of John Adams, Lincoln, and other revered American leaders, is there a through line, I suppose, Jonathan? Is there a through line if you're looking at their writings, trying to figure out their thought processes around these free speech restrictions? Is there something that connects their thinking? Because it's hard for me to look at someone like John Adams or to look at someone like Abraham Lincoln, who probably more than most Americans understood the value of freedom of expression. And yet at the same time, they took efforts to curtail it. Are there writings or are there insights into their struggles with free speech and what their justifications were? And are there any connections between them?
You know, what's interesting about these periods is that often the figures that propelled the crackdowns later in life expressed regret. John Adams did. He tried very hard to sort of blame others for the crackdown. He knew what happened in his administration was wrong, and there's a certain pathetic element to that. But even Thomas Jefferson, who ran against Adams in 1800 and won partially on free speech, he was able to make a pitch to the American people that we're losing this newly minted right of ours. And Adams was defeated, and free speech had a big role in that election. And yet Thomas Jefferson didn't go to the same extent as John Adams in terms of persecuting his and prosecuting his enemies, but he did allow it to happen. He did allow some prosecution to occur. And I think for all of these people, it is a sense of relativism. It's a sense of being in the moment, yielding to this temptation to just silence a few people. And they all claim, as they do today, that it's to protect the rest of us. I mean, that's what's funny about the anti-free speech movement today is the suggestion that this is a new movement. These are the same voices. They're the very same terms that we've heard throughout history. And yet there is a blindness, a willful blindness. I was testifying in Congress about the censorship system under the Biden administration. And finally, because of Elon Musk, we had proof. Because in my earlier hearings, I would have Democratic members say, you don't have any proof that there's any coordination, any communications. And there was just denial after denial, even though we had building levels of proof. But then Musk bought Twitter and released those files. And the proof was now inescapable and obvious. And so when I presented that in this hearing and said, okay, here's the proof, we now have, thousands of emails dealing with coordination between the government and what I call censorship by surrogates with these social media companies. And one of the members, Congressman Goldman from New York, said, well, Professor, you're a free speech absolutist. After all, you can't cry fire in a crowded theater. Every time I hear that line, my hair catches on fire. It, of course, is the line from Holmes in the Schenck case. I said, Congressman, can I just point out one thing? And that is, you just quoted Schenck, which is a case that was set aside by the Supreme Court. Holmes himself moved away from that position. But also, you just quoted the line that was used to justify the imprisonment of a socialist for pure political speech. Schenck was arrested for a circular that told people it was entitled, assert your rights. And then on the back, it said, long live the Constitution of the United States. It was simply telling people what their rights were in refusing to cooperate with the draft. That's where that line came from. That person was convicted, and Holmes used that line while upholding the conviction of Charles Schenck. And it's just such a crushing irony that the left now, which was the target of the Red Scare, the target of many of these periods, is now some of the most significant voices in favor of censorship, blacklisting, throttling, and other methods of controlling speech.
In my view, Jonathan, I don't think freedom of expression should ever be a political issue. It's something that is guaranteed to all Americans and should be available to all of us. But I remember growing up in the 80s and 90s and thinking, oh, free speech is more of a left-wing thing. Because back then, I grew up in the shadow of a lot of left-wing victories around freedom of expression on college campuses, stand-up comedy, and elsewhere. And it felt like it was people on the right who traditionally had a problem with freedom of expression. But now, only a few decades later, freedom of expression or free speech is viewed as something that's alt-right or right-wing. And it's just like those who have power, either culturally or institutionally, are always the ones, regardless of political party, who want to tamp down on the very thing that when they are out of power, they depend on to speak.
Oh, no, that's very true. And in fact, the book really does criticize many on the right historically. You've got people like Anthony Comstock, who was a nightmare of free speech, and he would crack down on feminists, people that he considered to be immoral. He was just a towering hypocrite, and he was incredibly hateful. And yet we still have a Comstock law that is enforced. But you're absolutely right that both sides have been villains in all of this, and it gets lost in the moment. But at the end of the day, what this book really tries to do is to have a type of reawakening, to suggest this is what we were at one time. This is where we began. It was a better place than we are now in. The fact is, the Constitution wasn't just written for times like this. It was written in a time like this. We've always had rage rhetoric. We've always had people who have lost their faith. They won't take that leap of faith that free speech requires. And at the end of each of these periods, it was neither the courts nor the Congress that saved us. In each of those periods, it was the public that ended the anti-free speech movements. It was the public that eventually said enough. When they finally saw Joe McCarthy on television, they said enough. When they finally saw what John Adams had done with the Alien Sedition Act, they said enough. And there's a sense of optimism that I have, which is often a struggle to preserve. But that's the nice thing about believing that free speech is a human right, that it's part of who we are. Because if it is something that's in our DNA, then it can't really be extinguished. You know, you can certainly, through a massive censorship system, reduce the appetite for free speech, but you can't really kill it if it's part of every human being. And that's the reason I remain an optimist, that if you look at polls, the American people are still opposed to censorship. And despite the unrelenting anti-free speech movement, they are still opposed to it. And I think that's a source of optimism.
And it seems like every couple decades, we Americans, we have to touch that burning stove of speech restriction to remember why speech restriction is a bad idea. But we have to touch it. We have to be like, well, maybe we should, okay. That was a bad idea. I feel regret now. But we just have to touch the stove.
I think that's so true. And you're right. And we get burned and we regret it. And that muscle memory sticks with us usually for one generation. And then we find ourselves having to have the same fight and argument again. You know, the greatest regret I have is not that I think we're going to lose this fight. I still remain optimistic that what we see in Europe will be hard to replicate here in the United States. I may be wrong. I have that optimism. One of the things I regret is what it has meant for my students, that higher education has become such a place of intolerance today that I never thought I would see it. I grew up in a liberal democratic family. I'm still quite socially liberal. And I grew up, as you just explained, with free speech as part of what I thought was the identity of the Democratic Party. It was certainly a liberal cause at that time. But it also manifested itself in higher education. I went to the University of Chicago, and I loved every minute of it because when I went to U Chicago, it was like walking into the Star Wars bar scene where you just had every possible political and philosophical view on campus. And, you know, I lived in a vegetarian cooperative, and in the basement, we had Trotskyites who would meet. And upstairs, we had militant vegans. Next door, we had libertarians. And I thought they were all insane. But I loved every single minute I spent with them. I loved speaking with people who could see something I was seeing, but see something so very different. And to me, that was higher education. That was what made me who I am today. And in some cases, perhaps they did change my views on the margins, but it wasn't that I was persuaded, but I was electrified by it. It probably set me on a course for being an academic. Today, students just don't have that. There's a level of intolerance and orthodoxy on campuses that I never thought I would see. But the greatest impact really is felt by the students. They are simply being educated on campuses where the spectrum of ideas is much, much narrower, and they don't really have as vibrant a debate or exposure that we had.
What is John Stuart Mill's harm principle as it relates to free speech, and how is it misused in the application of speech regulation on college campuses?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on John Stuart Mill because his harm principle is so useful in understanding how we can apply free speech without being absolutist, without saying that all speech is protected. Clearly, some speech is not protected. It's a very common criticism of anti-free speech advocates that, oh, well, Turley's an absolutist. Obviously, when someone is engaged in a murder conspiracy, they're using speech. Well, yeah, they are, but you're not punishing their speech. You're punishing the conspiracy to commit an act. That act is murder. In my view, you shouldn't be able to punish someone for arguing that the United States should be overthrown. If a country cannot withstand people who argue that it should not exist, then it really has less legitimacy to do so. But John Stuart Mill defined the role of government as protecting us from the harm of others. And he did not include in the harm principle protection from harmful ideas. He narrowly construed the proper role of the government as protecting us from being harmed so that each of us can live our lives to create the world around each of us that we believe is ideal. Now, many in academia have turned that principle on its head. They now argue that free speech is harmful and therefore must be curtailed. And in many ways, we have raised a generation of speech phobics. These kids have been told since secondary school that opposing views are triggering, that they shouldn't have to hear opposing views. And when they come to college and even law school, their level of tolerance is very, very low because they've been told that this is not something that they should have to tolerate. It flips the harm principle from being a protection of individual liberty to being its greatest nemesis.
You detail in the book how speech restrictions were historically implemented to guard against offending the most powerful, royalty, judges, elected officials, often under the charge of sedition. But these days, speech is being restricted to protect those our leaders deem to be the least powerful. To quote something you wrote in 2012, quote, "Increasingly, it seems that the West is rediscovering the tranquility that comes with forced silence. What is fascinating is that this trend is based on principles of tolerance and pluralism once viewed as the values underlying free speech," end quote. Historically, at least in the West and especially here in the US, free speech was intended to protect the most marginalized. Now it's being whittled away in their name. Why this shift?
Yeah, it is maddening for many of us because you don't need the First Amendment, for example, to protect popular speech. It's protected because it's popular. It was designed to protect the speech that was unpopular, the people that we most hated or feared. It was meant to protect the speech of people like Charlotte Anita Whitney, who, by the way, was arrested in her case because she spoke against lynchings. And that was the conviction upheld by Brandeis and Holmes and their colleagues. It protects people like Ida Wells, who was continually pursued by people that wanted to arrest her and indeed lynch her because she wrote against racism, against sexism at a time when that was very unpopular. But now free speech is suddenly being portrayed as something that is really a tool to preserve majoritarian values, that, we can't allow free speech to encourage people to have wrong ideas. The Biden administration, when pressed on the censorship system, explained in testimony to Congress that they actively try to combat disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. Now, malinformation is my favorite because this was defined as information that is true. These are facts that are true, but are still viewed as misleading others. That's included in what we're trying to censor today. And that really does show how we've sort of flipped the meaning of free speech and the values that define us.
People seem to forget that ideas are like music. What's popular today will be loathed tomorrow. A common refrain we hear today, Jonathan, is free speech is as robust as ever. No one's being thrown in jail because of what they say. Some people are simply facing social consequences for their speech, which is normal. But Mill, as you note, quote, believed that the threat to free speech in democracies was not the state, but the social tyranny of other citizens, end quote. So where do we draw the line between the kind of social tyranny that Mill warns against and the ordinary consequences that arise from offending your coworkers, your neighbors, your classmates?
Well, this was sort of the mantra that we often hear from the anti-free speech movement. It was even surprisingly picked up by Jon Stewart, who I did not view as particularly anti-free speech. I don't know where he comes down on this. But he recently said, what's the crackdown on free speech? People seem to be having no problem in saying stuff today. And it was, again, another maddening moment for many of us in the free speech community. First of all, you should protect free speech because of the values of free speech. Even the chilling effect that is created is something that is anathema to free speech. But the fact that things are going well for Jon Stewart is hardly the measure. What this book looks at are tragic cases today of academics and others who have lost their jobs, stripped of associations. Yes, they can still speak in some areas, but they have been censored on social media. They've been dramatically reduced in their ability to reach other people. Those are all attacks on free speech. I talk about one professor out of North Carolina who was a conservative professor at a university. We've seen conservatives and Republicans largely purged from faculty. Surveys by academics have indicated that in one study, over 40% of the departments didn't have a single Republican or self-identified conservative in their departments. And this one professor had faced a series of investigations and efforts to get him fired. And he had gone to court, I believe, 3 times, prevailed every time. And then he posted some dumb joke on social media, and it started again. And he was put under investigation. And they finally convinced him to accept a settlement to leave teaching. And almost on his last day, he went home and he blew his brains out. Now, obviously, a suicide, there's many causes for every individual in such a tragedy. But those people that say, oh, people can still speak, so that means there can't be any real threat to free speech, ignore the many, many cases of people who've lost their jobs and also the thousands of people who are silent because of this chilling effect. In academia, we've seen this for 30 years, that the people on campus that attack you take away everything that means anything to an intellectual life. They take away your ability often to speak, to associate, to get publications. That's what this professor, I think, was facing. For people like him, people like me, we've only wanted to teach. This is really what we want it to be. And when you get to that final day and you realize you'll have to walk away, it was too much for him. But I've talked to professors at Stanford, Harvard. Some of them were silenced because of views on COVID where they were vindicated, where they said you didn't have to close down schools, where they talked about natural immunities. All of those led to them being censored on social media, fired from associations. And I gave a speech recently at the University of Chicago, and many of these scientists were in the front row. And I asked them afterwards, have any of these associations, have any of your colleagues come back and said, welcome back, sorry we did that? And they said, no, none of them have had anything that has been reversed, anything regained. And so for people just to say, as long as someone's speaking, there's not an anti-free speech movement, it's the height of hypocrisy and willful blindness. People are being hurt in this. And I'll add one more thing. The crackdown during COVID, I don't have a horse in this race. I'm not qualified to talk about the science. I am qualified to talk about the need for scientists to have that debate. We shut down all of our schools, and that came at a huge mental cost to our students. European countries did not do that. But we didn't really have that debate in the United States. Many of those voices were banned on social media. And that's part of the cost of cracking down on free speech. It can cost lives. It can cost serious damage to people. when you don't let a debate on health or public affairs occur. And so I would counter all of those folks to saying that in this book, it is replete with examples of tragedies involving people. But also, I can tell you, I have a free speech blog, and I hear from academics every day. And they ask me to put things on the blog because they're just afraid to speak out because they don't want to lose their jobs and they don't want to stop being an academic.
I just spoke with Alina Chan out of the Broad Institute at MIT, and she was one of the first scientists to speak about the lab leak theory around COVID-19 all the way back in 2020. And she was shouted down by her fellow scientists, by politicians. She is still criticized by Anthony Fauci and her peers today. But the lab leak theory is looking more and more plausible. In fact, she just wrote an op-ed in the New York Times only a little over a month ago. And so it seems like her view that at least it's a very plausible theory has been vindicated 4 years after her views were being censored on Facebook as misinformation. It seems to me, Jonathan, similarly to how John Adams and Abraham Lincoln regretted later their restrictions on free speech. It feels like, again, we're going through that same cycle of we, in the moment, want to restrict free speech because we know we're correct. But then it seems over and over again, we have that same, almost like a hangover the next day. Oh, wow, maybe I shouldn't have done that.
No, I think there is that morning after that comes from every one of these periods. And I think COVID is a really good example. You had the New York Times science reporter telling other reporters not to report on the lab theory because people suggesting it were racist and that the theory itself was racist and unfounded. Now, federal agencies have said they believe it to be the true answer. Some of our agencies now believe it did escape from a lab. But even at the time, I was writing about it and saying, look, I'm not a scientist, but it seems to me a worthy debate to have. You have a Chinese lab right near the outbreak that was doing research on these viruses. I don't know if it's a natural or non-natural cause, but why on earth would you be censoring and banning people just for saying that they think that this could very well be the cause? And I think that is an example of this mob mentality that kicks in, where the media just piled on and portrayed all of these professors that I met at the University of Chicago as racist, extremists, conspiracy theorists, destroying their careers. But in the end, when they were vindicated, you just had this collective shrug and people walked away.
The subtitle to your book is Free Speech in an Age of Rage. And I would be remiss if I didn't touch on that. Can you briefly explain how free speech and the Madisonian system of government constructively directs rage towards productive legislative systems?
Rage is an interesting thing, because rage means so many different things to different people. That is, when you are enraged, it's often because you feel righteous, while someone else looking at you sees something dangerous. And rage is the outside limit of reason, right? It's all on the same spectrum. It is where reason breaks down, but it's usually an extension of reason. It's usually people who feel disenfranchised. They feel left out. They feel that they can't speak. That's what the Boston Tea Party was. It was rage that we celebrate as a moment of independence. And we have a hard time dealing with the rage of others. Now, what the Madisonian system does, and I admit I'm a Madisonian scholar. My students always joke that I can't talk 5 minutes without mentioning James Madison. But the brilliance of James Madison was that he and philosophers before him, like Montesquieu, saw factions as a natural part of politics, that human beings naturally fall into factions. And the problem with many constitutions, and I would put this certainly, I would include the French constitutions, and there were multiple because they failed so often, was that they would often ignore factions, the things that divide us. They would speak to the things that we have in common, this horizontal view. And I tell my students all the time, if you want to read a beautiful constitution, read one of the French constitutions. The French know how to write a constitution. When people come up to me and they say, Professor, I just love reading the U.S. Constitution, I know they haven't read it because it was written by the ultimate wonk. There's nothing particularly inspiring in the language of the U.S. Constitution, but it was designed to last. It was the all-terrain vehicle of constitutions. The way Madison did that is he saw us for what we are. It's not that he was cynical. It's not that he was pessimistic. He saw a natural inclination towards factions, and he created a system that harnessed that power, directing it particularly to the heart of the legislative system. Some of these constitutions that ignored factions, even resisted them, the U.S. system actually encourages their expression, brings them into the open where they can be transformed into majoritarian compromise. That's the brilliance of the Madisonian system. And the key to that is free speech and association, that you get that magical Madisonian moment when people are allowed to speak freely. And that's why Madison, of all the framers, was the best on free speech. He wrote in 1800 a wonderful paper, and it was a criticism of some of his contemporaries, including John Adams. But he basically said that there's a monster that lives within us, a monster that dwells in every country. And that's the monster of sedition, the monster of the prosecution of speech. He warned about that monster coming back. Part of what this book suggests is we have to slay Madison's monster. We have to finally really live up to what Madison and others laid out at the beginning of the Republic.
Yes, the Constitution is a beautiful and lasting document because it is a cynical one that anticipates the worst in us.
It is funny because Montesquieu and Madison both wrote about how if you want to create a government, you have to see human beings as they are. And unlike a lot of framers, Madison did not go to the Senate. He went to the House. He spent time in the Virginia legislature. He saw how legislation and sausage is made. And he had no delusions about the sort of factional and rent-seeking habits of legislation. But what other people saw as a danger, he saw as an energy source, that's what drives people to politics. That's what drives them to try to convince others. And he was able to harness that.
And I want to hammer home, because this was really eye-opening for me, because I guess I understood at more of an abstract level why restricting hate speech or angry speech was wrong. But your book really crystallizes the actual function of allowing rageful speech in that it's a release valve that prevents rageful acts from happening. There's that famous quote from MLK that people will cite, but I don't really think they understand it, which is a riot is the language of the unheard. But specifically in the time in which MLK was saying it, it's because that, yes, Black Americans could speak, but often they were prevented from speaking to a larger forum or from actually having their concerns heard. And so it ties directly to the Madisonian view of why rageful speech was valuable. And something that you hammer home in this book is that if you do not allow people to express their rage with speech, they will express their rage with violent acts.
Well, I think that's very true. And when I go through the 60s, I show how that's the case, where you had the radicalization of certain movements where they saw violence as the only way to achieve change. And that's what happens when you reduce free speech. And the other thing that the book talks about, particularly looking at the European anti-free speech movement, is how the attempt to control speech has been such an unmitigated failure. So in Germany, they have been engaged in massive censorship since World War II. I can understand why they wanted to prevent Nazi symbols and viewpoints and ideologies from being expressed. But it hasn't worked. When I speak with my German colleagues, I say, how's it going? Right? Every time I look, there's this burgeoning neo-Nazi movement. It has done nothing to deter neo-Nazis, and they've simply changed the design of the swastika. They've adopted new ways of expressing their hateful thoughts. But what it has been successful at is killing free speech. A recent poll of German citizens found that only 17% of German citizens said they felt free to speak in public. 17%. So you're silencing the wrong people.
As you said, if certain ideas are banned from the public square, they'll never be challenged and also, importantly, never be mocked. There was this video that I saw. It really it brought a smile to my face. I can't remember the exact context for it, but it was at a college somewhere in the South. And there was maybe 3 or 4 people who were doing young kids, like in their late teens, early 20s, who were doing Nazi salutes on or near a campus. And they were saying really hateful, racist things. But the thing that I loved about this video, there were these frat boys, right? Probably grew up in the South as well. And they were just there on video, endlessly mocking these neo-Nazis, just not even refuting their argument. I mean, how can you even refute arguments? That's stupid. But like they were just mocking them, making fun of them. That's exactly the point. That's why you want to bring these ideas into the light, not only so they can be refuted, which of course you want to be able to refute an idea on its basis, but also sometimes when an idea is especially rancorous, especially stupid, that it's good to just mock it, because when you can mock it in public, other people who might have been susceptible to falling victim to that idea can see, oh, that idea is really dumb.
That's absolutely right. And the adage that good speech can counter bad speech, that free speech is its own disinfectant, is very, very true. It's been shown over and over again. It's telling when people today argue for censorship because they don't want to have others hear opposing viewpoints. People today spend so much time trying to keep others from speaking. They spend less time in refuting those viewpoints. And it is a telling fact that those that resist free speech often defend their views as a matter of last resort. They spend so much effort, particularly in Europe, of silencing others. By the way, there's a dangerous side to this. If you want to stop the neo-Nazi movement, and most of us do, you don't force them underground. You don't turn them into self-described victims. You let them speak so you can see who they are, where they are, how many there are. You mock them, you respond to them. And you're absolutely right, Michael. It's in that process that they lose followers. They thrive in the darkness, which is what censorship is. It creates the appearance of tranquility by preventing others from speaking, but they don't stop. They just go underground, and that hate builds.
Yes, you deprive them of the martyr status they seek. It's like rooted in us as children. Like, hey, if you tell a kid not to push a red button, they're going to want to push that button really bad. And if someone can describe themselves as like, my ideas are so dangerous, they're so true that no one will allow me to speak, there's something about that that is attractive to people. They're like, wow, what does this guy have to say? If no one will let him say it, it must be really powerful and really truthful. And it's like, no, that's not the case at all.
No, I think that's right. I mean, you look at people like Anthony Comstock, what I spent some time on in the book, who is just a wonderfully horrific person. He really embodies the anti-free speech movement. If you just sort of reduce anti-free speech to its most obnoxious tar, that is Anthony Comstock. And what's fascinating is to see who he went after. I mean, his principal target were people like Victoria Claflin Woodhull. And you can see why. Woodhull was a libertine. She believed in free sex. She was a feminist. She created her own brokerage firm in New York. She was just light years ahead of her time. And it just drove Comstock insane. And that her sister, Tennessee Claflin, would be allowed to walk the streets of New York. And so he created his Society Against Vice. And he basically jimmied up criminal charges against him. He actually created a sort of frame where he personally mailed material from one state so that he could say that there was an interstate obscenity that had been transmitted through the mails. And he was able to get her prosecution. But he really shows the focus of the anti-free speech movement. He spent his entire life trying to silence others. He actually bragged how many suicides had occurred of people that he had targeted, including,
dear God,
including homosexuals. He judged his success by how many people he could silence. He made no effort to try to convince a single person.
Dark. He would have loved Twitter. This is a question separate from your book, but I selfishly am going to ask anyway. You've led a diverse career. You're currently a professor at George Washington University Law School, where you also run the Project for Older Prisoners, the Environmental Law Clinic, and the Environmental Legislation Project. You previously taught at Tulane. You've long written on legal issues for national publications like the New York Times and Washington Post, and of course on your blog. And you've appeared in national televised media dozens of times over the last 3 decades. But specifically as a lawyer, I wanted to learn more about what guides how you choose cases. You've represented Area 51 workers exposed to toxic chemicals via burn pits, a case that ultimately led to the U.S. government confirming that Area 51 did indeed exist. You represented former intelligence officer David Falk, who blew the whistle on the NSA, listening in on private calls home from American military officers, aid workers, and journalists stationed in Iraq. And you were lead counsel representing the U.S. House of Representatives in its 2014 constitutional challenge to the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. Now, this is just a small sample of your work, of course, but is there any sort of connective tissue, thematic or otherwise, that binds these cases together?
Well, they are certainly linked in the role of representation. I talk to my students all the time about being a lawyer, that what it is that sort of defines us. And when I used to give the orientation speech to incoming classes, I would often talk about our own villains. We talk about our heroes, Thurgood Marshall and others who fought for decades to change the law. But we often don't talk about our villains. And those are people who are our fallen angels. And one of the things I talk to my students about is the Leo Franks case. Leo Franks was a manager of a pencil factory who was accused wrongly of raping and murdering a young girl who worked in the factory. And his trial was an absolute outrage. The anti-Semitism in Georgia at that time was overwhelming, to the point that the jury couldn't even hear witnesses because there was a chant of "kill the Jew" that was so loud that they couldn't hear things in the courtroom. And eventually he was sentenced to life, and the judge had a breakdown. He wrote to the governor saying that he was ashamed that he could not do more. He would not sentence him to death, but Franks was clearly innocent. And indeed, the only witness against him turned out to be the murderer. He was a janitor. And the prosecutors, I think, probably did know he was the murderer eventually. They had evidence that clearly indicated that their chief witness was indeed the person who killed Mary Fagan. But he begged the governor to be basically a better lawyer than he was. And he died soon after that letter, by the way. And the governor was a person of great principle, and he commuted his sentence to life and sent him to a remote jail in the hopes that he would eventually release him. But he told his lawyer, if I release him now, he's a dead man. Well, he never got the chance because 5 cars broke into a rural prison, and they took Leo Franks and they drove him across the state and they hanged him near the grave of Mary Fagan. Now, what's the real tragedy to this is years later, I was sent a letter that was discovered in the Atlantic Public Library, and it was in a book of a lawyer who was in the car, and he wrote down the names of everyone in those cars. There was a who's who of the Georgia bar, including former judges, a future senator, and a future governor. It was the leading lawyers of Georgia. And I asked my students, how do we fall from grace? And the answer is when we forget the need to represent those that people hate, that people are afraid of. It's like the Scottsboro case, Scottsboro brothers that were convicted of raping 2 white girls on a train. They were also innocent. When the judge asked who will represent him or represent each of these individuals, the room was filled with lawyers because they got priority to sit in that courtroom, not one step forward, and they were all convicted. So if you're looking at sort of a guiding principle, one I tell my students is you have to step forward. What we do is important, not because we agreed with our clients, but because terrible things happen when lawyers stay silent.
Of all the cases you've been involved in, looking back, is there one that is the most meaningful to you?
Well, I certainly enjoyed representing the Five Wives vodka because I got free vodka out of it. It was the only payment I got, but they were banned because they showed a picture of polygamists on their vodka bottles. But I've had a great opportunity to do cases for people that were innocent. Not all my clients were innocent. I've represented accused spies and others. One of the accused spies was indeed innocent, and that's Danny King. He had signed a series of confessions, and the entire proceedings were classified. We had to do it in a skiff. But by all appearances, Danny looked like he was a major Soviet spy. The media said it was cut and dry. He signed all these confessions. The problem is that the confessions made no sense at all, and they had kept him up for days by blaring music in his room, having a phone ring every 10 minutes until he was just an absolute mess. He would have signed a statement that he was Daffy Duck. And indeed, some of these statements came close to that. And with my 2 Navy lieutenants, we were able to prove that he was innocent and he was released. And that was probably the most challenging case. And it was certainly the one that you really felt in the end that you had done something right. You can't always get that feeling in law. But when he walked out of the brig, I felt that I had paid back a little bit of the privilege of being a lawyer.
I want to end this conversation with an excerpt from a 1951 speech by Justice William O. Douglas, in which he said, quote, "Ideas, like the people who have them, need expression. The marketplace tests them, accepting a few, rejecting many. It is the interchange of ideas, the challenge to prejudices, that give any people the resiliency to meet challenging conditions," end quote. And the speech concludes with a passage you cite in your book, quote, "Restriction of free thought and free speech is the most dangerous of all subversions. It is the one un-American act that could most easily defeat us," end quote. So, Jonathan, thank you for your robust defense of free expression, regardless of who is doing the expressing. And today, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a great pleasure.